the winter of 1963, Sacred Heart Seminary stood like a fortress against the rolling fields, its stone walls darkened by age and rain. It was a place meant for prayer, for quiet study, for lives devoted to God. Yet that year, something broke the stillness. Father Thomas Gray was seen at morning prayers, head bowed, lips moving in silent devotion. By evening, his bed lay empty. His cassock hung neatly in the wardrobe. His Bible rested on the desk, open to a page about the shepherd who leaves the flock. No one saw him leave. No one heard the door open. The church called it a defection, a moment of weakness in a weary soul. But the seminarians whispered other things. They spoke of the nights when the walls seemed to murmur, low and constant, as if reciting prayers from another time. In the confessional, black candles appeared without explanation. Their wax pooled thick and cold in the corners. A heavy scent of incense would drift through the nave long after the last mass, clinging to the air like something alive. They said the air in the hallways felt different now, heavier, as if it pressed against the chest when one walked alone. At night, the wind rattled the high-stained glass windows, yet sometimes the sound was too steady, too deliberate, like the rhythm of breathing. There were rooms where the temperature fell so suddenly, your breath smoked in the air, even though the old radiators groaned and hissed with heat. Some swore they heard footsteps in the cloisters long after curfew. Not hurried, not frantic, but slow, measured, keeping pace with the beating of a heart. One student claimed he woke to find his door slightly ajar, though he always locked it. When he pulled it closed, he caught a glimpse of something at the end of the hall, a figure still and tall, the features lost in shadow. Yet nothing could be proven. Father Gray was gone. The seminary went on. Bells still rang. Voices still rose in hymns, and life appeared unchanged. But beneath the prayer, beneath the ritual, there was something else, something patient, something waiting. And in those stone halls, both the holy and the unholy seemed to draw breath from the same dark air. The seminary library was a place of stillness, where dust floated like drifting ash in the shafts of light that fell from high, arched windows. The air smelled faintly of paper and old wood, and the creak of the floorboards was the only sound that ever seemed to break the silence. It was here in the winter of 1979 that the archivist knelt beside a sagging bookcase to repair a warped shelf. His hand brushed something that did not belong, a section of wood that shifted when pressed. Beneath it, a narrow cavity yawned in the floor. Inside was a single, leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age, but its pages impossibly clean. When he opened it, he found a list of names written in an elegant but unsettling hand. Each name belonged to a priest who had once walked the halls of Sacred Heart. Some he recognized immediately: Thomas Gray, Alden Pike, James Bellamy. Others were less familiar, men who had left without ceremony, or whose fates had been quietly erased from record. Each name was followed by a date. The earliest was years before Father Gray's vanishing in 1963. It was the blank spaces that drew his eye next. Thin lines waited, ready for more names, more dates. Yet here and there a new entry had already been filled in, names of priests who were still very much alive at the time. And though decades had passed since many of the earliest names were written, the ink looked fresh, dark and wet in the light, as if the page had been marked only hours ago. The handwriting was sharp and curling, almost like talons had dragged across the paper instead of a pen. The archivist ran his fingertip above one of the letters and swore he could feel a slight raise, as if the ink had burrowed into the page. He thought he heard the faintest sound then, a soft scratching, the kind made by a quill, but the library was empty. He carried the ledger to his desk, but found his hands trembling. When he looked again, he noticed one of the blank lines had been filled. His own name was there, followed by a date, only 2 weeks away. He told himself it was some cruel joke, perhaps a relic from a forgotten prank or a twisted record by a long-gone brother. Yet he could not shake the feeling that the ledger had been waiting for him to find it. The book was returned to its hiding place that night, the floorboards nailed back into place. But the archivist would not return to the library again, and years later, when another hand pried those same boards loose, the ledger was still there, with his name now crossed out. It was the evening mass of October 12, 1965, when Father Olden stepped to the pulpit for what would be the last sermon he ever gave. The church was lit by the low amber glow of candles, their flames shivering against the vaulted ceiling. Parishioners remember that he looked thinner than usual, his collar loose at the neck, his eyes ringed with shadow. The first words of his homily came slow, as though each was being weighed before it left his lips. He spoke of the gospel feast, of the table laid for the faithful, but his voice quivered when he said the word banquet. He told them that somewhere, just beyond sight, another table had been prepared, a table not of light, but of shadow. Its guests were unseen, its host unnamed. He said this banquet had been waiting for centuries, and its hour was drawing near. The surviving audio recording captures his breath between sentences, uneven, as if he were fighting to keep his voice steady. He described the air in the chapel turning heavy, the sound of unseen chairs being drawn across stone, and the smell of wine so thick it clung to the lungs. He said that when the host would finally call, none could refuse the invitation, no matter how fiercely they prayed. Some recall that his gaze moved slowly across the congregation, not resting on faces, but somewhere just beyond them, as if he were watching figures standing in the shadows of the aisles. At one point, he paused so long that those in the front pews could hear the rustle of his cassock as his hands tightened at his sides. Then he spoke in a whisper, barely audible, of hunger that did not belong to men. The parish records note that several attendees left early that night, unsettled by his tone. One woman swore she heard the sound of cutlery faintly clinking together, though no one else acknowledged it. Another said the scent of meat roasting filled the air for a brief moment, though the kitchen stood cold. When the mass ended, Father Olden stepped away from the pulpit, gave no blessing, and walked alone through the side door of the chapel, into the night. By morning, his room at the seminary was empty, the bed untouched, the wardrobe closed. On his desk lay his homily notes, though the last page was missing. No one ever saw him again, and somewhere on that tape, beneath the hiss of static, there is a sound like the scrape of a chair against stone, and then a quiet, deliberate laugh. The winter of 1968 came down on the seminary like a siege. Snow fell in thick, unbroken sheets for 3 days, swallowing the grounds in white silence. The wind howled against the stone walls, shaking the narrow windows in their frames. By the second night, the decision was made to lock the place down. Doors were barred, windows sealed, every entrance and exit watched. No one could leave, no one could enter. Father Moran was last seen in his dormitory that night, seated on his bed with a rosary wound tight around his fingers. The storm pressed at the glass, rattling the panes like teeth in the cold. Lights flickered in the hallways, dimming to near darkness before flaring again. Just before midnight, one of the seminarians passing by swore he heard a voice from inside Moran's room, murmuring in a language he didn't recognize. He assumed it was prayer. By morning, the door to Moran's room was still locked from the inside. It took a master key to open it. But when they did, the bed was empty. His cassock still hung neatly in the wardrobe. The rosary lay curled on the desk, but there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no open window, only a patch of frost in the center of the mattress, perfectly shaped like a human form. When investigators arrived, they found something stranger still. On the inside of the chapel's tall windows, frost had formed in delicate branching patterns, not random, but deliberate. Twisting lines, curling fingers, shapes that looked like hands reaching upward, palms open, as if pressing against the glass from within. No one could explain how the ice formed on the inside in such detail. Several of the students whispered of something else. During the height of the blizzard, while the wind screamed over the roof, they heard another sound rising beneath it. A low, steady chant, spoken in Latin, not from any of the dormitories, but from deep under the altar in the chapel. The words were old, older than the Mass, older than the church itself, and carried on in a rhythm like a heartbeat. The storm broke the next day, and the snow began to melt under a pale sun. But Father Morin was gone, as if swallowed by the cold. And some say that when the frost finally slipped from the chapel glass, it left behind faint streaks, as though the hands had dragged slowly downward before letting go. The belfry of Sacred Heart rose high above the seminary, its narrow windows cut to let the sound of the bells carry over the fields. Few ever climbed its steep wooden stairs, and in winter the air up there was so cold it seemed to burn the lungs. It was on a still February morning that the groundskeeper noticed something unusual. Through the narrow slit of a window, he saw a strip of black cloth swaying gently against the pale sky. When they climbed to investigate, the smell of soot hit them first, sharp, acrid, out of place in the clean winter air. There, hanging from a beam just below the largest bell, was a cassock, torn at the hem, blackened with smoke, and yet swaying though the air in the tower was utterly still. The cloth seemed almost to breathe, lifting and falling in a rhythm of its own. On the floor below the bells, the ropes that should have hung straight for ringing had been tied together, not in a tangle, but in a deliberate pattern, the loops and crossings forming a symbol unfamiliar to most. A priest who came to bless the space froze when he saw it. He recognized the design from forbidden texts, a heretical sigil, banned by the church in the 14th century, said to be used in rituals meant to bind the souls of the faithful. The symbol, when traced in air or rope, was meant to call something that could not be named aloud. In medieval accounts, it was used, not in worship, but in hunger. Those who employed it believed that prayer could be inverted, bent into a summons for something that listened from the dark. What unsettled the investigators most was how the ropes had been knotted so high above the floor, requiring a ladder that had not been brought into the tower. The knots were tight, almost fused into the fibers, as if they had been pulled into place with immense force. The cassock was removed and locked away, but several who handled it claimed the soot left on their hands did not smell like wood smoke. It was heavier, metallic, like the residue from burning oil. Some noticed too that the cloth was warm to the touch, though the tower air was biting cold. The belfry was closed off after that, but on certain mornings the groundskeeper swore he could still see something hanging in the high shadows, shifting slowly in air that never moved. And when the bells rang, the echo carried a strange undertone, as if another sound was ringing with them, from somewhere far older than the tower itself. It began without announcement. Sometime in the autumn of 1970, a notice appeared on the chapel door, written in careful script, calling for special evening choir practices. The time was strange, 10 o'clock, long after the usual curfew, and stranger still, the sessions were to be held with no electric lighting, only candles. The seminarians who attended remember the air being colder than it should have been, the flames bending and guttering as if uneasy. The man who led them called himself a visiting choirmaster, tall, thin, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes. He spoke little outside the music. No one remembers him giving a full name. His robes were unmarked, without the crest of the seminary, and yet no one in authority questioned his presence. He carried himself with the calm authority of someone who belonged, and so he did. The music was unlike anything they had sung before. Not Latin, not Greek, not any tongue they recognized, though the syllables seemed to settle naturally on the tongue. The melodies wound slowly upward, and then fell away like a sigh, as though the song itself was breathing. Some said the notes seemed to vibrate in the bones, resonating deep in the chest. Those who sang for more than a few nights reported strange dreams. They would wake in darkness, heart pounding, with the echo of the hymn still in their ears. Some swore they could still hear it, faint and distant, as if drifting up through the floorboards. One student described the sensation of standing in the chapel during practice and feeling the stone beneath his feet grow warm, as though something far below was stirring. No record exists of when the practices stopped. One evening the chapel was simply locked, the candles gone, the notice removed. The choirmaster was never seen again. None of the staff claimed to know him, and no official record places such a man in the seminary's employ. Over the next 2 years, several of the young men who had attended those sessions vanished, some in the middle of term, others over holiday, their rooms left as if they had simply stepped out and never returned. Those who remembered the choir nights rarely spoke of them, but one who did recalled a final, unfinished hymn. The last notes had been held so long the air seemed to hum, and in the stillness that followed, he thought he heard a voice, low and distant, answering from somewhere far below the chapel floor. The new window was unveiled on a bright spring morning in 1971, sunlight flooding the chapel in red and gold. It showed Saint Bartholomew at the moment of his martyrdom, his face calm though his body bore the marks of his suffering. At first it was admired for its detail, the folds of the robes, the delicate shading of the skin, the almost lifelike expression in the saint's eyes. But over the years, admiration turned to unease. Students began to notice that no matter where they stood in the chapel, the saint's gaze seemed to follow them. It was subtle at first, a trick of light, perhaps. But then some swore the eyes would narrow slightly, or tilt as if tracking their movements. A few claimed the irises seemed darker than they remembered, the pupils wider, swallowing more of the light. More disturbing still was what happened to his wounds. The first year, the cuts were faint, almost symbolic. By the 5th, the colors had deepened, the red spreading just enough to suggest fresh injury. Some seminarians avoided sitting in the front pews altogether, unnerved by the way the saint seemed to look directly into them. In 1993, long after the first whispers began, a team of art historians was brought in to restore the glass. Under magnification, they found something no one expected. Hidden within the colored panes, etched so small it could not be seen with the naked eye, was text. Lines of Latin, lifted directly from the Church's oldest exorcism rites. But the words were wrong. Where the rites called for banishment, the etched letters had been altered to call for welcome. Prayers, meant to drive spirits away, had been inverted, made into invitations. Whoever had crafted the window had worked with both mastery and intent, embedding these changes so deeply into the glass that they could never be removed without destroying the work entirely. No record could be found of the artisan who made the window. The commission documents were missing from the seminary archives. The only trace was a faded invoice with no return address. Even after the discovery, the window was left in place. Some claimed removing it would only make matters worse. And so Saint Bartholomew remains, bathed in shifting light, his wounds a little deeper each year, his eyes fixed on all who enter. On cloudy days when the chapel is dim, some swear the faintest shimmer moves across the glass, as if the saint is blinking. It began as part of a simple preservation project. Boxes of old photographs, curled and yellowing at the edges, were brought out from storage so they could be scanned and catalogued. The images were of graduating classes from Sacred Heart Seminary, each row of young men standing stiffly in their robes, faces solemn under the weight of expectation. It was during the 3rd day of sorting that one of the archivists noticed something unusual. In the far corner of the photograph from 1956, a figure stood apart from the others. He was dressed in black, though not in the cassock or robes of the clergy. His face was partially in shadow, but the eyes, dark, fixed, unblinking, seemed to meet the camera directly. The archivist assumed he was a faculty member and moved on. But then came the photo from 1962. The same figure, now at the opposite end of the group, half hidden behind a pillar. Again, the face was turned toward the camera, the expression unchanged. In 1969, There he was again, standing in the back row among the graduates, though no one remembered a man of his description being part of that year's class. Over the course of 2 decades, he appeared in at least 9 photographs. He was never in the same position twice, sometimes standing, sometimes seated, sometimes peering from the edge of the frame as though caught mid-step. But in every image, he was looking straight at the lens, the stare unbroken by time. When the images were shown to former students and faculty, not one could recall seeing him in person. The man's features were clear enough: sharp cheekbones, narrow jaw, hair cut short, yet he seemed to leave no impression in anyone's memory. Out of curiosity, the archivists fed the images into a facial recognition program. The software searched through police records, census archives, and global databases, but returned nothing. It could not even find a partial match. It was as though the man's face had never been recorded anywhere but in these photographs. One of the technicians examining the digital scans late one night noticed something else. In each image, no matter the year, the light seemed to fall differently on the figure than on the rest of the group. Shadows stretched in the wrong direction, or highlights gleamed where there should have been none, as if he stood under a light source separate from the world around him. The photos are locked away now, kept in a sealed drawer in the archives, but those who have seen them say the figure looks clearer each time they're brought into the light, and that his eyes seem a little closer to the foreground than they should be. It was late on a rain-slick evening in 1975 when Father Latham was called unexpectedly to the confessional. The chapel was nearly empty, the candles burning low, their flames bowing under the weight of the damp air. He slid into his side of the booth, expecting the voice of a weary parishioner seeking solace. Instead, what came through the screen stopped him cold. The man on the other side spoke slowly, as though each word had to be drawn up from somewhere deep. He said his name was Father Alden, the same Father Alden who had vanished a decade earlier without a trace. Latham's first thought was that it was a cruel joke, but the voice was steady, deliberate, with a weight that was hard to dismiss. Yet the details were wrong. Alden spoke of events that never happened, masses that were never said, and faces that did not exist in any record. He spoke of walking the corridors of the seminary at night and seeing rooms where there should be none, doors that opened into a darkness that breathed. At times, his words broke into whispers, the syllables curling into a language Latham could not place, each one carrying a resonance that seemed to shiver through the wood between them. Halfway through, Latham glanced at the small recorder he kept for difficult confessions. The needle jumped erratically, as though it were picking up sounds just beyond hearing. The voice on the tape had a layered quality, as if 2 people, or more, were speaking at once, in perfect unison. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the voice stopped. The booth was silent. Latham waited, then stepped out, opening the penitent's door. It was empty. No one had left. The main chapel door was still bolted from the inside. When he returned to the booth, he noticed the wood felt wrong under his palm. The panels were warm. The grain warped and bubbled in places, as though they had been exposed to great heat. Yet there was no scent of smoke. No scorch marks, only a faint, metallic tang in the air. The tape was handed over to the diocese, but within a week it was reported lost. Latham never heard it again, though in the months that followed he swore he could still recall the cadence of that voice. And sometimes, when alone in the chapel, he thought he heard it again, not from the booth, but from somewhere just behind him, breathing in time with his own. The first sighting came on a windless night in January, when the snow lay deep and undisturbed across the seminary grounds. A student, restless and unable to sleep, stood at his window and saw them, a slow-moving line of figures in dark robes, walking in single file along the outer wall. Each carried a lantern, but none of them glowed. The glass panes were empty, as if meant to hold a light that never came. The figures did not speak. Their movements were measured, almost ritualistic, the steps in perfect unison. The snow muffled all sound, so that even their boots left no crunch in the silence. And yet, moments after they passed, the air felt charged, as though the night itself had drawn in a breath. By morning, the student told a friend, and soon others began to watch for the procession. It was always the same hour, just at the stroke of midnight, and always the same number of figures, though no one could agree on how many. Some counted 9, others 11, though all swore there was one taller figure at the front, who never turned his head. When one group of seminarians dared to follow, they found the snow beneath the figure's feet strangely untouched. The robes brushed the surface, yet left no lasting mark. On the rare occasions tracks did appear, they dissolved within minutes, the snow smoothing over as if time itself were being erased. Those who trailed too close reported strange lapses. One moment they were behind the procession, their breath visible in the frozen air. The next they were standing alone in the dark, the figures gone, their own footprints leading nowhere. Hours would pass without their knowing, and some awoke lying in snowdrifts miles from the seminary walls, with no memory of how they had traveled. No one ever saw the procession begin or end. It seemed to materialize whole from the shadows, then fade into the distance without changing pace. From certain angles, the lanterns caught the moonlight and gave the illusion of faint shapes moving within the glass, like moths trapped behind cold panes. Over the years, the Midnight March became a whispered legend among the students. Few dared to watch for it, and fewer still tried to follow. Those who did carried a quiet dread afterward, as if part of them had been left out there in the snow, walking still in the line, waiting for the lantern to be lit. They found the journal during a routine search of the seminary's attic, buried beneath a collapsed shelf of hymnals and dust-choked vestments. The leather cover was cracked, the spine warped by age, yet the pages inside were intact. The name written on the first page was clear: Father Bellamy, one of the last priests to vanish before the seminary was closed. The early entries were ordinary, almost dull. Notes about parish schedules, repairs to the chapel roof, reflections on scripture. He wrote in neat, deliberate strokes, the kind of handwriting shaped by years of copying liturgy. But as the months passed in the journal, his tone began to shift. By the middle pages, small asides began to creep in. Mentions of odd sounds in the lower halls at night, the sensation of being watched during prayer. One entry noted finding the chapel doors unlocked in the morning, though he had locked them himself before bed. Then came the first reference to the thing in the crypt. The words were underlined twice, the ink pressed hard enough to leave an indentation on the following page. He did not describe it directly, only hinted that it had always been there, older than the walls, older than the bells, and that the priests before him had learned to live with it. In later entries, the writing grew erratic, the lines slanting, blotches of ink marring the margins. He spoke of hearing it move, the sound like stone grinding against stone, and of whispers curling through the air when he walked past the chapel at night. He wrote of dreams in which the pews were filled, not with parishioners, but with hooded figures whose faces hung in shadow, their attention fixed on something in the dark at the altar. The last complete entry was the most unsettling. Bellamy claimed it had begun to grow impatient, that it hungered in ways I cannot speak, and that it must be fed before it chooses. He wrote that the other priests had grown silent, avoiding his eyes, and that some had already been given to it. The final page is smeared, the ink trailing off mid-sentence. The last words are jagged, almost illegible, but they read, "It is here with me now," and the line ends in a violent streak across the page, as though the pen had been dragged away. No one knows how the journal ended up in the attic, far from Bellamy's quarters, but those who handled it afterward said the leather smelled faintly of earth, damp, cold, and deep, as though it had been resting somewhere far beneath the seminary floor. The first to speak of it was a maintenance worker sent to repair a burst pipe in one of the east wing corridors. He returned pale, refusing to go back, claiming the walls had shifted as he worked. Not just the groaning of old timber or the settling of stone, but a slow, steady swell beneath his hands, as if the building itself were drawing breath. At first his story was dismissed as nerves. The seminary was old, its walls thick with plaster over lath, prone to the creaks and sighs of age. But then another worker, called in weeks later to patch a section of peeling paint, described the same sensation, a faint expansion, a contraction, the rhythm disturbingly like the inhale and exhale of something alive. They began to compare notes, quietly at first. Each time it happened in different parts of the building, the library's narrow aisles, the hallway outside the chapel, even in the cloister walk where sunlight pooled in the afternoons. The air would still, and the wall beneath their palms would push outward ever so slightly, before settling back as though satisfied. One man, braver or perhaps more curious than the rest, claimed he had seen more than movement. While scraping away old plaster in the sacristy, he swore a crack opened in the wall, long and thin, just wide enough to reveal something beneath. Not wood, not stone, flesh, pale and damp, stretched taut over something that shifted behind it. And in the center, an eye. It blinked once, the lid slow, deliberate, before the plaster knit itself back together, leaving no trace of the opening. The day after his account reached the supervisors, another priest vanished. His absence was first noted at morning prayers, his stall in the choir empty, his Bible still resting on the pew. No sign of struggle, no sound in the night to mark his leaving. Only a fine dusting of plaster on the floor beside his bed, as though the wall there had been disturbed. The workers refused assignments in certain wings after that, citing bad air, unstable flooring, any excuse that kept them away from the spots where the breathing was felt most strongly. Still, those corridors remained strangely warm, as though the walls held a heat of their own. And at times, if you stood very still in the hush of the chapel, you could feel it. The faint press of the wall at your back, slow and patient, as if the building were drawing you just a little closer. The bell tower at Sacred Heart was a familiar presence, its peals marking the hours with a steady, almost comforting rhythm. There were 12 bells in all, each cast in bronze, each with its own voice. Students learned their tones like the notes of a hymn, the deep resonances folding into the life of the seminary. But over the years, a strange account began to surface, always whispered, never spoken aloud during the day. On nights before a disappearance, some claimed they heard a 13th toll. It was not counted among the clear, ringing voices of the 12. This tone was deeper, so low it seemed to vibrate in the bones rather than the ears. The sound carried no brightness, no metallic clarity. Instead, it rolled through the dark like something rising from far below the earth. Those who heard it often found they could not move while it sounded. The first toll would freeze them where they stood, the next few pulling at the air around them, until it felt as if the night itself leaned in to listen. By the time the final vibration faded, the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was heavier, expectant. Attempts to record the phenomenon always failed. Microphones captured only the 12 bells, leaving no trace of the lower tone. One technician swore the moment it should have sounded, there was a faint distortion, a flicker in the audio, as though something had passed too close to the recorder. In 1981, the diocese called in a bell foundry expert, a man who had studied ancient casting techniques and claimed he could identify any bell by sound alone. He spent 3 nights in the tower, documenting the chimes, tracing the inscriptions along the bronze. On the 4th night, he stayed past midnight, determined to hear the 13th toll for himself. The next morning, his bed in the guest quarters was empty. His notes were found stacked neatly on the desk, ending mid-sentence. The last line read, "It's not up here." The bells continued their measured song, 12 voices strong. But some nights, when the fog rolls in from the fields and the moon hangs low, the 13th tone returns. Those who hear it say, it doesn't sound like metal at all. They compare it to a door opening far underground, or a breath drawn by something that has been silent for a very long time. And when that note fades, the seminary seems to hold its breath with it. The entrance to the crypt was found by accident, during repairs to the chapel floor. Beneath a section of loose stone lay a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness, the air seeping up from below damp and heavy with a scent, both sweet and sour. The steps were worn in the middle, as though countless feet had descended before, though no record in the seminary archives spoke of this place. At the bottom was a chamber older than the building above, its walls made of rough-hewn stone slick with moisture. In the center stretched a long wooden table, warped with age yet still standing, its surface covered with the remains of a meal. Loaves of bread sagged under the weight of mold, fruit collapsed into its own skin, and great platters of meat lay blackened and curling. The air was thick with the smell, decay threaded with the faint, cloying sweetness of wine. There were chalices too, dozens of them, each brimming with a dark, viscous liquid that had long since thickened, the surface congealed into something almost solid. Yet when the chalices were lifted, the contents shifted slightly, as though stirred by an unseen hand. Along the walls, fresh candles burned. The wax dripped in thin, pale streams down the sconces, but there was no sign of anyone having entered to light them. The flames did not flicker in the stale air. They stood straight and still, casting long, unbroken shadows across the stone. The carvings came last, a slow realization as the investigators' eyes adjusted to the gloom. Hooded figures stood etched into the walls, their arms outstretched as if in greeting. At first they seemed identical, but then the faces became clear. Each one was distinct, captured in unsettling detail, and each face matched the likeness of a priest who had vanished from the seminary. Some were smiling faintly, others solemn, but all seemed to gaze toward the table, toward the empty chairs spaced along its length. There were more chairs than there were carvings, as if the feast were far from finished. One investigator claimed to hear the faint clink of cutlery as they turned to leave, though no one else admitted to it. Another swore the carving's eyes followed them up the stairs. The staircase was sealed, afterward, the stone replaced. But in the years since, those who work in the chapel say they sometimes feel a draught rising from the floor during Mass, warm, with the scent of wine, and carrying the faintest echo of voices, as though the banquet below has never truly ended. It was a routine survey of the surrounding land that first revealed it, a faint anomaly in a set of satellite photographs taken at noon. The seminary's shadow should have stretched due east, perfectly in line with the sun. Instead, it bent unnaturally, angling toward the north, as though drawn by something beyond the reach of light or geometry. The distortion was subtle in older images, almost invisible unless one knew to look. But in recent years, the pull had grown more pronounced, the shadow lengthening toward a patch of open field that on the surface held nothing at all. Curiosity led researchers to the county's historical maps. There, in the faded ink of a survey from the late 1800s, another structure was marked in that exact spot. A small abbey, its name smudged with age, noted only as having been dismantled in 1891. The records of its removal were thin, just a line or two in the municipal ledger. No reason was given. The locals, however, still told the old story. They spoke of an abbey that had turned inward, its monks withdrawing from the surrounding community, refusing to ring their bells for Mass. Smoke was seen rising from the cloister at odd hours, thick and acrid. Travelers passing at night heard chanting that did not sound like prayer. And then, one winter, the doors stood open and the abbey was empty. Not abandoned in haste, every bed neatly made, every book in place, but emptied of life entirely. The few who claimed to know more whispered that the brothers had made a pact. What kind of pact? No one could say, though the phrase was always spoken with a certain weight, as though repeating it risked being overheard. Some insisted the land was cursed, others that something had been promised and not yet claimed. When the seminary was built, decades later, it was said the architects intentionally faced the main chapel away from that northern field, as if to deny it acknowledgement. And yet, as the satellite images now showed, the shadow refused to obey that design. On certain days, when the light is strong and the air clear, The shadow stretches farther than the building's height should allow, reaching out thin and distorted toward the place where the abbey once stood. Those who've gone to stand in that field describe an uneasy stillness there, as if the wind dies before touching it. And some say, if you close your eyes, you can still hear faint chanting, growing louder, as though it's waiting for the doors to open again. Father Gallo was known for his discipline. Every morning, before the sun had risen, he would walk the long stone corridor to the chapel, his footsteps the only sound in the stillness. On the morning of his disappearance, a student rising early for study saw him push open the heavy chapel doors at the first light of dawn. Gallo paused briefly on the threshold, as though listening, before stepping inside. Minutes later, the student heard something strange. At first it was a muffled thud, deep and distant, like something shifting beneath the earth. Then came the scream. It was sharp, sudden, and unmistakably human, but it did not seem to come from above or around him. It came from below, rising through the floor, as if the stone itself carried the sound. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the ears. The student, frozen in place, could not bring himself to open the chapel doors. When others arrived for morning prayers, they found the space empty. There was no sign of Gallo, no hint of where he might have gone. It was only when they approached the altar that they found his Bible. It lay open, its spine flat against the cloth, the thin pages turned to the book of Revelation. The passage spoke of the opening of the seals, of the earth trembling and the sun turning black. But what drew the eye was not the text, it was the pages themselves. The edges were blackened, curled inward as though burned, yet no ash had fallen. The scorch marks radiated outward from a single point in the margin, a black circle no larger than a coin. The chapel showed no other damage. The air did not smell of smoke. The floor beneath the altar was cool to the touch. Yet more than one person later admitted to feeling a faint vibration there, as if something moved far below the stone, pulsing in time with a heartbeat too slow to be human. Father Gallo's quarters remained untouched, his belongings neatly arranged, his bed made. The only absence was the man himself, and whatever it was he had heard in those first moments after stepping into the chapel that morning. To this day, the Bible is kept locked away in the diocesan archives. The scorch marks have not faded, and when the book is opened, some claim the air around it feels warmer, and that if you listen closely, there is the faintest sound beneath the paper, like breathing. Father Marcello arrived at Sacred Heart with the quiet certainty of a man who had seen darkness before and believed himself prepared for it. The diocese had sent him not to search for the missing, but to cleanse the place, to drive out whatever had taken root in its walls. He carried with him a worn leather case containing relics, holy oils, and a crucifix so old the silver had dulled to grey. On his first day, he walked the halls slowly, blessing each threshold, murmuring prayers under his breath. The seminarians who remained avoided his gaze, speaking in hushed voices, as though afraid to tell him too much. That night, he held Mass in the chapel. The candles burned low but steady, and his voice carried with calm authority. Nothing unusual happened. It was the second night when the change came. Shortly after midnight, a dull sound woke the few residents who slept nearby, a low, dragging scrape, as if something heavy were being pulled across the floor. A faint smell followed, bitter and metallic, seeping into the corridor from under Marcello's door. No one approached until dawn. When they finally entered his quarters, the room looked as though a storm had passed through it. The bedclothes were twisted and torn, the chair overturned, pages from his missal scattered across the floor. The leather case lay open, its contents spilled, but the crucifix was missing. The air was thick with the smell of ash, though nothing in the room had burned. It was the mirror that drew their attention. Across the glass, in broad, uneven strokes of black ash, were 3 words, Non est hic. He is not here. The letters were smeared, as if written in haste, yet the ash clung stubbornly to the surface, resisting every attempt to wipe it clean. There was no sign of Father Marcello himself. His coat still hung by the door, his shoes neatly placed beneath it. The only open path was the narrow window, though it was too small for a grown man to pass through, and besides, the snow on the sill outside was untouched. In the days that followed, the mirror was removed from the room and locked away. Yet even in storage, the words remained, the ash refusing to fade. Some who have seen it since claim the letters seem to shift, growing thinner or thicker depending on the light, as though still being traced by an invisible hand. Father Marcello's disappearance marked the last in the long string of vanishings. After him, the diocese ordered the seminary closed, its doors barred, its windows shuttered. But those who were there in those final days say the halls did not feel empty. They felt watched, and at night, if you passed Marcello's old quarters, you might catch the faint smell of ash and the sense that someone was standing just beyond the threshold, waiting to be let in. They found the room while clearing out the east wing, an area long abandoned after water damage made it unsafe. Behind a crumbling plaster wall, a hollow sound revealed a space no one knew was there. The opening was narrow, just wide enough to slip through, the air inside stale and heavy, as though it had been sealed for decades. The chamber was small, its stone walls bare except for the rows of shelves that lined them. On each shelf sat masks, dozens of them, carved from wood, darkened with age. The faces were all different, yet every one was frozen in an expression of horror. Mouths open mid-scream, eyes wide and unblinking, brows furrowed in agony. It was the names that stopped the investigators cold. Burned into the wood, along the edge of each mask was a name, and every name matched one of the priests who had vanished from Sacred Heart. The lettering was crude, as if done in haste, but unmistakable. Some of the masks looked newer than others, the paint still bright, the wood smooth. Others were cracked and faded, their features worn by time. Yet in all of them, there was a strange sense of life, as if the expressions had been captured in the moment of some final, desperate realization. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. Upon it lay a single mask, unfinished. The features were only half carved, the mouth not yet shaped, the eyes hollow spaces. No name was burned into its edge. A small carving knife rested beside it, its blade rusted, its handle worn smooth from use. One of the investigators reached to touch the unfinished mask and swore the wood felt warm, almost pliable, as though it had not yet fully hardened. The others insisted it was just the closeness of the air, but none of them lingered long after that. The room was resealed, the opening bricked over, but the memory of it stayed with those who had entered. Some said they dreamed of the masks afterward, seeing them not on shelves but in the pews of the chapel, each face turning slowly toward them. And more than one recalled the strange, unmistakable feeling that the unfinished mask was not waiting to be carved, it was waiting to be claimed. The reel was found in a rusted metal canister at the back of the seminary archives, mislabeled as a recording of a 1950 Easter service. The 8mm film inside was brittle with age, the celluloid curling at the edges, but it still ran cleanly through the projector. What it revealed was not Easter. The opening shot showed the chapel, its candles lit, but casting an oddly dim light, as though the flames struggled to burn. The pews were full, yet every figure seated there was wrong. One by one, their faces came into view, and with a sick certainty, the archivist recognized them. Every man was a priest who had vanished from Sacred Heart. At the altar stood the celebrant, his features hidden behind a wooden mask painted with a distorted smile. His vestments were black, embroidered with symbols that seemed to shift when the camera lingered too long. The Mass began, but it was unlike any liturgy recorded in the Church's history. The structure was there, but the words were wrong. The prayers reversed, the syllables bent into guttural, almost animal sounds that scraped at the edges of the ear. The congregation answered in kind, their voices low and resonant, their replies swelling into a rhythm that made the camera tremble. There was no bread, no wine, only a single covered chalice at the center of the altar, which the celebrant never touched. Midway through the reel, the camera panned slowly across the pews. The priests sat perfectly still, yet their eyes tracked the lens with cold precision. The longer the shot lingered, the more the shadows in the room seemed to grow, stretching up the walls like dark water climbing stone. In the final minute of film, the celebrant lifted his arms and spoke in a tone so low it made the image flicker. The congregation bowed their heads. Then, without warning, the camera tilted upward toward the ceiling. The frame caught the high rafters of the chapel and something moving there. A shape detached itself from the darkness above, descending not with the fall of a body, but with the slow, steady glide of something that had no need of gravity. The film ended there, the screen going white in a burst of light as the reel snapped. No one knows who filmed it, or why it was hidden. But those who've seen it say the sound of that reversed liturgy stays in the mind for days afterward, looping faintly, like a prayer that refuses to end. The bell tower of Sacred Heart had always been a point of pride, its 12 bronze voices ringing out over the surrounding countryside for more than a century. But research into its origins revealed a history far older and far darker than anyone had imagined. Beneath the seminary's official blueprints, buried in municipal records, was a survey of the land dating back to the mid-1600s. It marked the presence of a stone watchtower, built not by missionaries, but by an unnamed settlement long vanished from the area. The tower's purpose was not defensive. It was described in fragmentary journals as a place to call down the hungry. No further explanation was given. When the seminary was constructed in the late 1800s, the old watchtower was not demolished, but incorporated into the base of the new bell tower. The lower stones, rougher and darker than the rest of the structure, still bear faint carvings, circles within circles, intersecting lines and symbols with no direct match in Christian iconography. The bells themselves carry their own strange history. Records show they were cast from salvaged metal taken from the wreck of a merchant vessel that ran aground off the coast in 1872. The ship's entire crew had vanished without a trace, their belongings still aboard, meals half-eaten in the galley. The salvage crew reported finding deep gouges in the timbers, as though something had clawed at them from the inside. Scholars who studied the bells noted that their tonal range was unusual, each bell producing harmonics lower than its size should allow, the kind of resonance that can be felt in the chest. In certain weather, the sound seems to sink rather than rise, as if the notes are being pulled downward instead of carried on the wind. One historian, after months of research, suggested the bells were never meant to summon the faithful. Instead, they might have been tuned to call something else entirely, something that once answered from the hills or the deep earth. The diocese dismissed the theory, but quietly restricted access to the tower. Yet locals still tell of certain nights when the bells ring on their own, long after curfew, their notes slow and heavy, carrying for miles in the still air. Those who hear them say the sound leaves the heart racing, though they can never remember the exact melody afterward. And some claim that when the 13th toll comes, that deep, bone-shaking note no one admits to hearing, the shadow of the tower stretches just a little farther than it should, reaching into places where light has never touched. He agreed to speak only once. Meeting in the dim back room of a roadside diner far from the seminary grounds. His hair was white now, his hands trembling as he lit one cigarette after another. It was only after Father Marcello's disappearance that the Vatican could no longer dismiss the rumors as superstition or local hysteria. The pattern was undeniable. 17 priests gone. No trace, no answers. And so they sent an order rarely spoken of outside the church's most guarded circles, men trained not only in scripture but in rites too old to appear in public liturgy. They arrived in the dead of winter, their presence marked by a sudden tightening of protocol. Black cassocks with crimson sashes, crucifixes worn openly on chains of iron. They carried satchels filled with relics, splinters of the true cross, bones of saints sealed in glass, vials of water blessed in Jerusalem. Alongside these were texts bound in leather so aged it flaked at the touch, pages inked with prayers written backward, words meant to bind rather than release. For 2 days they walked the halls of Sacred Heart, marking thresholds with salt and oil, muttering in languages few recognized. The chapel bells rang at strange hours, their tolls slow and deliberate. At night chants echoed through the corridors, deep and resonant, shaking dust from the rafters. Those who remained in the seminary kept to their rooms, feeling the air grow heavier with each passing hour. On the second night, the chanting stopped abruptly. Silence fell over the building, thick and absolute. By morning, the Vatican's men were gone. Their rooms were untouched, beds made, belongings neatly arranged, relics still in place. Only their black cassocks were missing, as though the men had walked out wearing nothing but the clothes they had arrived in. A search turned up nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of a struggle. The last time anyone had seen them was as they entered the chapel shortly before midnight. Within a week, the seminary's doors were chained shut. Official statements declared the closure to be for renovations, citing structural instability and outdated facilities. But no scaffolding was ever raised, no workers brought in. The building stood untouched, its windows dark, the bells silent, at least during the day. Locals say that at night, when the fog is thick and the wind low, you can hear the sound of chanting carried from the direction of the seminary. The words are too faint to make out, but the rhythm is steady, and the voices are many. Some swear they see the faint glow of lanterns moving through the chapel's high windows, as if a procession winds its way through the pews even now. The Vatican has never sent another team, and the official records list the building as awaiting restoration, a phrase that has remained unchanged for decades. He smoke curling between us like a veil. He had been a seminarian in the early 1980s, leaving abruptly after what he called the night in the chapel. It had been late, long after curfew, when he woke with the unshakable sense that something was moving through the halls. He followed it, barefoot on cold stone, the air heavy with the scent of candle wax. The chapel doors stood open. Inside, the light was dim, though the candles on the altar burned without flicker. They were all there, he said. Every priest who had vanished over the years, not ghosts, not visions, but solid and real, their cassocks hanging still around them. They knelt in the pews, all facing backward, their hands clasped tightly in their laps. Their faces were turned toward the rear of the chapel, away from the altar, their eyes fixed on something he could not see. They were whispering. The sound was soft, steady, perfectly in unison. He could not make out the words, but the tone was wrong. Not prayer, not chant, but something that seemed to move through the air like a low vibration. The more he listened, the more he felt it in his bones rather than his ears. He told me he wanted to leave then, but found himself stepping forward instead, drawn closer by a pull he could not explain. The whispers grew sharper, shaping syllables that twisted into something almost familiar, until his vision blurred and the room seemed to tilt. The next thing he remembered was standing outside, the chapel doors closed behind him, the candles dark. Hours had passed. His feet were numb from the cold, though he had no memory of walking there. He left the seminary the next day, packing in silence, and never returning. For decades, he spoke of it to no one. When I asked him what the priests had been looking at, what held their attention so completely, his hand shook so violently, he spilled his coffee. There was something in the back, he said finally, his voice breaking, something waiting for me to look. After that, he refused to say more, and when I tried to contact him again, I was told he had moved on, leaving no address, no forwarding number, as though vanishing was the only way to keep what he'd seen from finding him again. The Sacred Heart Seminary stands alone now, its once proud spire rising above the tree line like the finger of a warning hand. The gates are chained, the iron cold and pitted with rust. Wooden boards cover the windows, though some have warped and split, leaving thin gaps through which the wind sighs like a restless breath. Grass grows tall along the paths where processions once walked, and ivy claws at the stone, as if trying to pull the building back into the earth. From the road it looks silent, but locals say that when the fog rolls in from the river, the silence breaks. The bells toll, their notes low and slow, drifting out across the empty fields. There are always 12 strikes, until sometimes there are 13. Those who hear the extra toll never seem eager to talk about it. On certain nights, the sound of singing rises from the boarded chapel. The hymns are familiar but wrong. The words sliding backward, syllables unraveling into something older than the language they were meant to hold. The notes hang in the air longer than they should, carrying a weight that makes the chest tighten, the eyes water. Some claim to have seen movement inside, the faint glow of candlelight passing behind the warped glass, the shadow of a figure pacing the upper halls. A few insist they've caught glimpses of more than one, robed shapes standing in rows, their faces hidden, as still as statues. No one goes inside anymore. The chains on the doors are heavy, and those who've tried to cut them swear they've grown warm to the touch, as if resisting. The boards across the windows hold fast, even when the nails are rusted through. Yet the disappearances in the surrounding towns have not stopped entirely. A traveler gone missing on the road. A vagrant who never wakes from the bench where he sleeps. A curious photographer who fails to return after trying to capture the seminary in the fog. The building waits, its shadow still stretching too far, pointing north toward the field where the old abbey once stood. No one tends to it, but it does not fall into ruin. The stone remains solid, the roof unbroken, as though something unseen keeps it whole. And sometimes, in the grey hours before dawn, a figure can be seen at the highest window of the tower, watching the road below, unmoving, waiting, as if it knows that eventually the doors will open again. And when they do, whatever began here may not be finished, only begun anew.